So here's something to think about. If you want to find God, where do you look? That question, for whatever set of reasons, that question has come to me in conversations with a number of people in this past week or so. And when that happens, I kind of think God might be trying to get my attention about something, so it's good to listen when things like that come. If you want to find God, where do you look? I wonder, too, given the reading we just heard, whether the disciple Simon Peter had really given much thought to that question about where to look for God before the story we just heard about the miraculous catch of fish. We don't get much backstory about Peter, but this morning's reading is actually just the second time that he appears in Luke's gospel. The first was just a few verses before what we heard today. At that point, Jesus had begun performing these works of healing as he took the good news of God on the road. And one of those healing miracles happened at Peter's house. Jesus had come there, though we aren't told why, and he came in and healed Peter's mother-in-law, who had a high fever. There's no indication in the story of what Peter thought about that or how he responded to it, but you got to figure it must have made an impression. And then we come to today's story, what we just heard. And as that begins, we get no sense at all that Peter's looking for God or anything else for that matter. He's just come in from a long night of fishing with his partners, James and John. This was their business, so this was not a good night, coming back empty-handed. And I imagine, Peter's just trying to get his equipment cleaned up and put away so he can go home. But Jesus gets into Peter's boat there on the shore and asks him to put out into the water a little bit to put some distance between Jesus and the crowds he's teaching. And so Peter does that, goes along. Maybe he figured he owed Jesus at least that much for coming and healing his mother-in-law. So although he really probably just wanted to go home, Peter finds himself listening to Jesus teaching about God with wisdom and authority and power. And when Jesus is finished and the crowd is talking among themselves, Jesus turns to Peter and suggests that he go back out on the lake, go back and try his luck again. And Peter says, "Master, we have worked all night long and caught nothing. Yet if you say so, we'll let down the nets." So Peter and his partners head back out, and they haul in this overwhelming catch we heard about, enough to make 2 boats start to sink. Now, Peter doesn't really have the best reputation in Scripture in a lot of ways, and later on in the gospel story, he will show himself not always to be the sharpest knife in the drawer, okay. But here, even Peter gets it, that this isn't just a wise rabbi there in the boat with them, and not even just a talented healer, but Peter finds himself in the presence of the divine, and it's not really a warm and fuzzy feeling, because he knows he's not worthy to be in God's presence, and he's afraid of what might happen to him next. But Jesus completely reframes that moment for him. It's not that Peter has accidentally stumbled into the heavenly throne room and needs to get out before somebody catches him, Instead, Jesus has come onto Peter's everyday run-of-the-mill fishing boat in order to inhabit his everyday run-of-the-mill life. Don't be afraid, Jesus says. I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to join you. So come on, let's see how rich and how meaningful life can really be. Let's go. So Peter found God in his fishing boat. What about us? What about you? What about me? Well, blessedly, God shows up in many ways, for me at least, which is handy because I don't always listen all that well, and it takes several media to get in touch with me sometimes, whether that's through reading something or prayer or conversations with you all. It also happens when I am blessed to be able to get together with friends, including some friends I have known quite a long time now, 6 of us who grew up in seminary, or came to know each other in seminary. At that point, we called ourselves the Six Pack. And we pledged that we would continue getting together after seminary too, because it mattered to be able to do that. Apart from a hiatus for COVID, we have done that every year since we graduated, which was 20 years ago this May. And we also talk a couple of times a month on Zoom. And in fact, I will be on vacation this week and next, and part of that time, Ann and I will get to spend with these friends. I remember the ordination service for one of us. One of our seminary professors had come to preach, and she said, "I'm not sure what it is that the 6 of you get together to do, but I do know you eat well." Which is true, and we still do, actually. And frankly, the 6 of us don't know what we get together to do either. I mean, rarely do our trips involve cool activities or pilgrimages to sacred sites or something like, priests are supposed to do, I guess. I don't know. We just get together to get together and to check in and to see how life is for each of us and to eat lots of chips and queso. And that doesn't sound like much, honestly, as I say that. I mean, it doesn't sound that special, especially not repeated 20 times. But when we get together, we always leave refreshed and renewed for this crazy, wonderful, exhausting, holy work that lies back home waiting for us. So that's at least one way I hear God. But I think for many of us, maybe for most of us, I mean, if we were going to write a story about God coming and calling someone into divine service, I don't think we'd write a story like what we heard in this morning's gospel. I think it might be more like the Old Testament reading, with smoke filling the temple and the building's foundation shaking and seraphs flying around, which are giant winged cobras, by the way. Just a little extra drama for your morning. So maybe actually we wouldn't write it with the giant flying cobras, but the rest of it, possibly. I mean, we kind of like a good Hollywood treatment for our most significant moments. And maybe we figure God must work that way too. And God does sometimes. I mean, you do hear stories and have experiences of, the equivalent of the voice of God booming out, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" But most often, I think Jesus comes to us to share chips and queso instead. I mean, he comes when you're out there on your fishing boat having a long, unproductive night. He comes and inhabits normal life, even the least compelling parts of normal life. There he is. And there, when you least expect it, Jesus calls you to reimagine what your normal life could mean. And that call to Peter, it wasn't something completely outside his experience. Jesus didn't come to him and say, "Do not be afraid, from now on you will be a nuclear engineer," Instead, Jesus recast Peter's own experience, taking how he lived and what he knew and orienting that toward realizing God's purposes and priorities for the people around him. So all that is just to say, it's great to seek out a mountaintop experience. There's a lot to be said for looking for God by climbing the heights and seeing what you can find. But it's good to remember, I think, that as Christians, The truly astounding thing that we claim about God is that the same Lord who fills the temple and shakes its foundations with awesome power also comes to your fishing boat and inhabits the day-to-dayness of your life. So maybe that's the message we should take away. You know, when you're at work, when you're doing the laundry, when you're putting the kids to bed, when you're sharing chips and queso with your friends, listen for the voice of God in that moment. I don't think you'll so much hear it rattling the rooftops as whispering in your ear. But listen for the ways that God might be asking you to use precisely who you are to bring the light of love into somebody else's darkness. Because you, each of us, but you specifically, are fearfully and wonderfully made, as the psalm says, created in God's own image and likeness. And you never know when the presence of you showing up at the opportune moment just might be the presence of Jesus for someone who needs love precisely the way you bear it.